The bullet tore through the canvas roof of the stagecoach, just as Victoria Lawson pressed herself against the leather seat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Outside, men shouted in rough voices, their horses circling the stagecoach like wolves around wounded prey, and the driver's panicked commands to the team had gone silent moments ago in a way that made her stomach twist with dread. She had traveled from Philadelphia to Williams, Arizona territory to start a teaching position, carrying everything she owned in 2 leather trunks strapped to the top of this God-forsaken coach, and now rustlers wanted to take it all, including possibly her life. Another shot rang out, this one striking the wheel hub with a metallic ping that made the whole coach shudder. Victoria clutched her reticule tighter, feeling the small derringer inside that her father had insisted she carry. 2 shots. That was all she would have if these men broke through the door. The other passengers, an elderly merchant and his wife, huddled together on the opposite bench, their faces pale as milk in the dim interior. Through the small window, Victoria could see at least 5 riders, their faces covered with bandanas, their guns gleaming in the harsh Arizona sun of late September 1878. "Open up or we will shoot every last one of you," a voice called out, thick with malice and something else, maybe whiskey. "We want the strong box and whatever else you got." The driver, bless his stubborn heart, had not answered. Victoria wondered if he was already dead, slumped forward in his seat with a bullet in him. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, thinking maybe if she surrendered herself they would take what they wanted and leave the elderly couple alone. She was 22 years old, educated at a proper finishing school, trained to teach literature and music to children, and she had never been more terrified in her entire life. Just as her fingers touched the brass handle, a different sound cut through the chaos. It was not a gunshot, but something more primal, a roar that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The rustlers' horses began to whinny and stamp, and one of the men cursed violently. Victoria pressed her face to the window, trying to see what had changed, and that was when she saw him. He came down from the ridge like an avalanche given human form, his massive frame moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone so large. His buckskin clothing stretched tight across shoulders that looked capable of moving boulders, and his dark hair hung past his shoulders, wild as the mountain winds. In one hand, he carried a rifle that looked almost small against his bulk, and in the other, he held a hunting knife with a blade that caught the sunlight like a shard of ice. His face, weathered and hard, wore an expression of such fierce determination that Victoria felt her breath catch for an entirely different reason than fear. The rustlers had not expected company. The first one to react swung his pistol toward the mountain man, but before he could fire, the stranger had closed the distance and struck him across the face with the rifle butt. The rustler went down like a felled tree, blood spraying from his broken nose. The others wheeled their horses, firing wildly, but the mountain man moved like smoke, dropping behind a boulder and returning fire with deadly precision. One rustler grabbed his shoulder and nearly fell from his saddle. Another's horse reared, throwing its rider hard against the rocky ground. "Go, go now," the mountain man bellowed toward the stagecoach, his voice deep as thunder rolling across the mountains. But the driver was indeed slumped forward, and the lead horses stamped nervously in their traces, going nowhere. Victoria made a decision that her proper Philadelphia upbringing would have deemed absolutely scandalous. She threw open the coach door and jumped down, her traveling dress catching on the step and tearing, but she paid it no mind. Her hands fumbled with the coach's front wheel as she used it to climb up to the driver's box. The driver had been shot in the arm, blood soaking his sleeve, but he was alive and conscious, just too weak to manage the reins. Victoria grabbed the leather straps with both hands, having watched her father drive a carriage enough times to have a vague idea of what to do, though she had never actually done it herself. "Hold on," she shouted back through the coach window to the elderly couple, and then she snapped the reins hard. The horses, already spooked and eager to flee, needed little encouragement. They lunged forward, the coach jerking so violently that Victoria nearly lost her seat. Behind her, gunfire continued to crack and echo off the canyon walls. She risked one glance back and saw the mountain man now holding 2 pistols, firing with both hands as he moved backward toward his own horse, a huge gray stallion that stood ground-tied near a cluster of juniper trees. He was covering their escape, buying them time with his own life as collateral. 3 of the rustlers were down or mounted on fleeing horses, But two remained, and they looked furious. One of them kicked his horse into a gallop, chasing after the stagecoach. Victoria whipped the reins again, urging the team faster, but the wounded driver grabbed her arm weakly. "The brake!" he gasped. "Release the brake lever." She looked down frantically, spotted the wooden lever, and shoved it forward. The coach immediately picked up speed, bouncing over the rough terrain so hard that she had to grip the seat with her knees to stay aboard. The canyon road ahead curved sharply, and she had no idea if she could keep the coach from overturning. Behind them, the pursuing rustler was gaining ground, his gun raised. Victoria heard the shot, felt the wind of the bullet passing near her head, and something inside her snapped from fear into pure, stubborn rage. "Not today," she said through gritted teeth. "Not today, you bastard!" Then, like something out of a fever dream, the mountain man thundered past the coach on his gray stallion, riding so hard the horse's hooves barely seemed to touch the ground. He had somehow fought his way clear of the remaining rustlers, and now pursued their pursuer. Victoria watched in amazement as he closed the distance, stood up in his stirrups, and launched himself from his saddle onto the rustler's horse. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and dust, rolling across the hard-packed earth. The horses scattered. Victoria had no choice but to keep driving, to trust that the stranger could handle himself, because the coach was careening toward that sharp curve, and if she did not focus, they would all end up smashed against the canyon wall. She leaned into the turn, pulling the left rein harder, shouting at the horses in a voice she did not recognize as her own. The coach tilted, two wheels lifting briefly off the ground, and the elderly woman inside screamed. Then the wheels crashed back down, and they were through the curve, racing down a straighter stretch with rock walls rising on either side. Victoria let the horses run for another quarter-mile before she gradually applied the brake, bringing them down from a gallop to a canter, then to a rough trot, and finally to a shaking, blowing halt. Her entire body trembled as she set the brake and wrapped the reins around the lever. The wounded driver had passed out beside her, his breathing shallow but steady. Victoria climbed down on legs that felt like water, then helped the elderly couple out of the coach. The woman was crying, and her husband kept saying, "Thank you, young lady, thank you," over and over while patting her arm with his shaking hand. "We need to see to the driver," Victoria said, trying to sound calm and capable while her insides felt like jelly. She had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but she had clean petticoats that could serve as bandages. The merchant helped her ease the driver down from the box, and they were tearing strips of fabric when the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Victoria's hand went to her reticule, fingers closing around the derringer. She positioned herself in front of the elderly couple, ready to defend them with her two little bullets if needed, her heart climbing back into her throat. But the rider who came around the bend was alone, and he rode the gray stallion. The mountain man. He looked dusty and had a fresh cut above his left eye that bled down his temple, but otherwise he appeared unharmed. He reined in the stallion and dismounted in one fluid motion, then walked toward them with long strides that ate up the ground. Up close, he was even more imposing. He stood well over 6 feet with a chest as broad as a barrel and arms that strained the buckskin shirt he wore. His face was all hard angles and sharp planes, tanned dark from years under the sun, and his eyes were a startling pale blue that seemed to see right through her. His hair, nearly black, hung loose around his shoulders, and a few days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. He looked wild and dangerous and completely magnificent, like something out of the adventure novels Victoria secretly loved to read. "You all right, miss?" His voice matched the rest of him, deep and rumbling, with a slight roughness that suggested he did not use it often. "Yes," Victoria said, then realized she was still pointing the derringer at him. She lowered it quickly, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Thank you. You saved our lives. Those men would have killed us." He shrugged as if rooting 5 armed rustlers was something he did every day before breakfast. "They would have taken what they wanted and maybe left you alive. Maybe not. The Turner gang does not have much reputation for mercy." He moved past her to examine the wounded driver, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he checked the bandages Victoria had applied. "Good work. He will live if we get him to a doctor soon. Williams is about 8 miles ahead." "You know where we are?" Victoria asked, relieved. She'd been driving blind, just trying to put distance between them and the attack. "I know every rock and tree from here to the Grand Canyon," he said simply. He looked at the team, checking each horse for injuries, then examined the coach itself. One wheel had a bullet lodged in the hub, and the canvas top sported 3 holes, but overall the vehicle had survived. "You can drive the rest of the way if you take it slow. The wheel will hold." "I do not even know your name," Victoria said suddenly. "You saved us, and I do not know who you are." Those pale blue eyes fixed on her, and she felt a strange flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear. "Logan Vance," he said after a moment. "I have a claim up in the mountains about 20 miles north of Williams. I was bringing furs into town when I heard the shooting." "I am Victoria Lawson," she said, extending her hand the way she would to any gentleman in Philadelphia. He looked at her hand for a moment, as if unsure what to do with it, then took it carefully in his much larger one. His palm was calloused and rough, his grip warm and strong, and Victoria felt that flutter intensify into something that made her breath come quicker. She withdrew her hand, flustered. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. They are traveling to California." Logan nodded to them, then turned back to Victoria. "You're going to Williams?" "Yes, I'm the new schoolteacher. At least, I'm supposed to be, assuming I arrive alive and in one piece." She tried to make it sound light, but her voice shook a little on the last words, the reality of how close they had come to death finally hitting her. Something shifted in Logan's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look less like a wild mountain man and more like a concerned human being. "You did good back there. Not many people would have climbed up to drive a coach with bullets flying. That took sand." Victoria felt absurdly pleased by the compliment, more pleased than she had any right to be from a stranger's praise. "I did not think. I just acted. Best way sometimes." He walked back to his stallion and swung up into the saddle with easy strength. "I will ride ahead, make sure the road is clear. You follow slow and steady. If I fire my rifle, stop and wait for me to come back. Understand?" "Yes," Victoria said. "But what about the rustlers, the ones who got away?" "They will not bother you again today. They are licking their wounds and heading for the border." He touched his fingers to his forehead in a kind of salute, then rode off at a canter, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of red dust. Victoria stood watching him go until the elderly Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat gently. "We should get moving, Miss Lawson. The driver needs a doctor, and I confess I would feel safer behind walls before nightfall." "Of course," Victoria said, pulling herself together. She helped them back into the coach, made sure the driver was as comfortable as possible on the floor of the driver's box wrapped in blankets, then climbed back up herself. Her hands still shook a little as she picked up the reins, but she took a deep breath and released the brake. The horses moved forward at a steady walk, and Victoria focused on keeping them on the road and not thinking about those terrifying minutes when death had been breathing down her neck. Except she kept thinking about Logan Vance instead, the way he had moved like lightning made flesh, the startling color of his eyes, the rough gentleness of his hands when he had checked the driver's wounds, the way her heart had kicked when he had looked directly at her. She told herself it was just reaction to danger, that her emotions were overwrought from the attack, that she was being a silly romantic fool, but she could not quite make herself believe it. The 8 miles to Williams passed slowly, each one feeling twice as long as it should. The canyon walls gradually widened, giving way to more open terrain dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The sun hung lower in the western sky, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Victoria saw Logan several times in the distance, always ahead, always watching. True to his word, he did not signal danger, and they encountered no one else on the road. When Williams finally came into view, Victoria felt relief wash over her like cool water. The town was larger than she had expected, with a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, a train depot at one end since the railroad had come through a few months before, and even what looked like a small church with a white steeple. People moved about their business, and the sounds of civilization, hammering and voices and a dog barking, seemed impossibly normal after the violence of the afternoon. Logan waited at the edge of town, and when Victoria brought the coach alongside him, he gestured toward a building with a painted sign that read, "Dr. Samuel Foster, Physician and Surgeon. Bring the driver there. I will fetch the sheriff and tell him about the attack." "Will I see you again?" Victoria asked before she could stop herself. Heat flooded her cheeks at her own boldness, but Logan's expression softened again in that way that made her stomach flip. "Williams is not that big a town," he said quietly. "I come in for supplies every few weeks. I imagine our paths will cross." Then he was gone, riding toward a building with a star painted on the door. Victoria drove the coach to the doctor's office, where a young man who introduced himself as Dr. Foster's assistant helped carry the wounded driver inside. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and steady hands, assured Victoria that the driver would be fine and praised her bandaging. Mrs. Whitmore insisted on pressing a $10 gold piece into Victoria's hand despite her protests, saying she was an angel sent by God to save them. By the time Victoria retrieved her trunks from the coach and arranged for them to be taken to the boarding house where she would be staying until she could find more permanent lodging, dusk had settled over the town. The boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who had come west with her husband during the gold rush days and stayed after his death, was clean and welcoming. Mrs. Chen took one look at Victoria's torn dress and dusty face and immediately drew a bath, then insisted she eat a full meal of stew and fresh bread. "I heard about the attack," Mrs. Chen said as Victoria ate at the kitchen table, too tired to be properly sociable in the dining room with the other boarders. "Logan Vance brought down 5 rustlers by himself, or so the story goes. That man is something of a legend around here. Lives up in the mountains like a hermit, only comes to town when he needs supplies or when there is trouble. Last winter, he carried a family of settlers through a blizzard on his back, practically. The winter before that, he tracked down a gang that had been stealing cattle and returned every head to its rightful owner." Victoria listened, fascinated despite her exhaustion. "Does he have any family?" "None that I know of. He has been in these mountains for about 5 years, maybe a little more. Showed up one day with his horse and his rifle and his traps and carved out a life in the high country. Some say he is running from something back east, but nobody asks. This is the territory, honey. Everyone has a story they do not tell." Mrs. Chen patted Victoria's shoulder kindly. "You get some rest. Tomorrow I will take you to the schoolhouse and introduce you to the mayor. He has been anxious for the new teacher to arrive." Victoria climbed the narrow stairs to her small room under the eaves, every muscle in her body aching. She washed her face in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and lay down on the narrow bed, fully expecting to fall asleep the moment her head hit the pillow. Instead, she found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's events over and over. The terror of the attack, the wild ride, and most of all, Logan Vance, appearing like some kind of avenging angel, fierce and strong and unexpectedly gentle. She had come to Williams to start a new life, to escape the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society, where she was expected to marry some approved young man and become a proper society wife. She wanted adventure, purpose, freedom. She had definitely found adventure today, though perhaps more than she had bargained for. And she'd found something else too, something she had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. She had found a man who made her heart race and her palms sweat and her carefully ordered thoughts scatter like autumn leaves in the wind. Sleep finally came, bringing dreams of pale blue eyes and strong hands and the sound of a voice like distant thunder. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sun streaming through Victoria's small window and painting golden squares on the wooden floor. She dressed in her second-best traveling suit, a deep green that her mother had always said brought out the color of her eyes, and pinned her dark blonde hair up in a neat chignon. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw shadows under her eyes from the restless night, but otherwise, she looked presentable and professional, like a schoolteacher should look. Mrs. Chen had breakfast ready, fresh eggs and bacon, and something called a tortilla that was surprisingly delicious. 3 other boarders sat at the table, 2 miners heading up to a claim north of town, and a traveling salesman who talked too much about his wares. Victoria ate quickly and let the salesman's chatter wash over her without really listening. Through the window, she could see Williams coming to life, people moving about their business, a wagon rolling down the main street, and a dog chasing a chicken between buildings. "The mayor's office is just across from the general store," Mrs. Chen said as Victoria finished her coffee. "But the schoolhouse is at the east end of town, near the church. It is a nice building, just built last year. The last teacher, Miss Morrison, left to get married and moved to Prescott, so the children have been without proper instruction for nearly 3 months. The parents will be grateful to have you." Victoria thanked her and stepped out into the bright morning, her reticule tucked under her arm. Williams looked entirely different in daylight, almost peaceful, and she found it hard to believe that just yesterday she had been fleeing for her life. The mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still holding snow even in late September. The air smelled of pine and dust and something cooking that made her stomach rumble despite the breakfast she had just eaten. She found the mayor's office easily enough. Mayor Thomas Brightwell was a round man with a cheerful face and a firm handshake. He welcomed her enthusiastically, assuring her that the town was absolutely delighted to have an educated teacher from Philadelphia, and that he had complete confidence she would do wonders with the children. He gave her the keys to the schoolhouse, a ledger listing all the enrolled students, and a small advance on her salary to help her get settled. "We heard about your troubles yesterday," Mayor Brightwell said as he walked her to the door. "Terrible business, but Logan Vance set those rustlers running, I hear. He's a good man to have around when trouble strikes, even if he is strange as they come. Not much for society or conversation, but he has a good heart." "He saved my life," Victoria said simply. "I owe him a debt I can never properly repay." "Well, if you see him again, maybe you can teach him some manners," the mayor said with a laugh. "That man is rough as a pine knot, could use some civilizing influence." Victoria did not think Logan Vance needed civilizing. She thought he was perfect exactly as he was, wild and strong and free. But she just smiled politely and took her leave, walking down the street toward the schoolhouse. Several people nodded to her as she passed, and a few women looked at her with open curiosity. News traveled fast in a small town, apparently. The schoolhouse was a simple wooden building painted white with a small bell tower on the roof. Inside, it was just one large room with rows of wooden desks, a blackboard at the front, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner for winter heating. Books lined shelves along one wall, and someone had hung cheerful curtains at the windows. It smelled of chalk and wood polish, and that particular scent that all schools seem to share. Victoria felt something settle inside her chest, a sense of rightness. This would be her domain, her purpose. These children would be her responsibility and her joy. She spent the morning cleaning and organizing, arranging the desks, examining the books, writing her name on the blackboard. "Miss Lawson," she wrote in her careful script, then stepped back to look at it. "Miss Victoria Lawson, schoolteacher. A new life, a new beginning." She was standing on a chair reaching for a high shelf when the door opened and a voice said, "Settling in?" Victoria turned so quickly she nearly fell off the chair. Logan Vance stood in the doorway, seeming even larger in the confined space of the schoolhouse. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his hair tied back with a leather cord, his face shaved clean to reveal a strong jaw with a small scar near his chin. He wore different buckskin clothing, clean and well-maintained, and he had removed his hat, which he held in his hands. "Mr. Vance," Victoria said, stepping down from the chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "I did not expect to see you again so soon. I was in town anyway, finishing business with the sheriff. Thought I would check that you made it to the boarding house safe last night." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable in the civilized setting of the schoolhouse, like a wolf who had wandered into someone's parlor by mistake. "That's very kind of you," Victoria smoothed her skirt, suddenly self-conscious. "As you can see, I am fine. More than fine, actually. I am looking forward to starting lessons next week." Logan nodded, his eyes moving around the room, taking in the neat rows of desks and the books on the shelves. "You like teaching?" "I have not started yet, but yes, I believe I will." She paused, then added, "In Philadelphia, my opportunities were limited. Women of my class are expected to marry well and manage a household, nothing more. But I wanted something more than that, purpose, independence. So when I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Arizona Territory, I applied without telling my parents. By the time they found out, I had already accepted the position and purchased my train ticket." "They were not happy?" Logan asked. "They were furious," Victoria admitted with a small smile. "My mother cried for a week. My father threatened to cut off my allowance, but I am 22 years old and I'm tired of living according to someone else's expectations. So here I am." Something like respect flickered in Logan's pale eyes. "Takes courage to walk away from comfort and family. Not everyone has it." "You did," Victoria said. "Mrs. Chen said you have been living in the mountains for 5 years, away from civilization. That takes courage, too." Logan's expression closed off a little, becoming unreadable. different kind of courage, or maybe just stubbornness. He turned his hat in his hands, then seemed to make a decision. I'm heading back to my claim this afternoon, but I will be coming to town again in 3 weeks or so before the first snow. If you need anything, you can leave word with Tom Farley at the general store. He knows how to reach me if it is urgent. Thank you, Victoria said. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask him to stay, to talk longer, to tell her about his life in the mountains. But what right did she have to ask such things of a virtual stranger? I hope your trapping goes well. He gave her a long look, and Victoria felt her pulse quicken under the intensity of his gaze. Then he settled his hat back on his head and nodded. Welcome to Williams, Miss Lawson. If you are half as brave as you were yesterday, you will do fine here. Then he was gone, and Victoria was left standing in the empty schoolhouse, her heart beating too fast and her thoughts in complete disarray. She barely knew this man. They had exchanged perhaps 100 words total, and yet she could not stop thinking about him, could not stop remembering the way he had moved, the sound of his voice, the feeling of his hand briefly holding hers. She told herself it was foolish. She told herself to focus on her new position, on preparing for her students, on building her new life. She told herself that Logan Vance was exactly what Mayor Brightwell had said: strange, rough as a pine knot, unsuited for civilized life. But her heart did not listen to her head, and when she returned to her organizing, she kept glancing at the door as if he might come back through it. The 3 weeks that followed were full and busy. Victoria threw herself into her work with single-minded determination. She met her students, 17 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and found them eager to learn despite the months without a proper teacher. She established routines, assigned lessons, and discovered that she had a natural talent for explaining difficult concepts in ways that young minds could grasp. The parents were appreciative and supportive, often sending small gifts of food or offering to help with repairs to the schoolhouse. Victoria also began to find her place in the small community of Williams. Mrs. Chen introduced her to the other women in town, and while some of them were suspicious of an educated Easterner, most were friendly enough once they realized Victoria did not put on airs or judge them for their rough frontier manners. She attended church on Sundays, joined a quilting circle on Wednesday evenings, and helped organize a social event to raise money for new books for the school. But through all of it, through every busy day and every evening activity, Victoria found her thoughts returning again and again to Logan Vance. She would catch herself looking up whenever someone entered the general store, hoping to see his tall form. She would listen to conversations around town, hoping to hear someone mention his name. She told herself it was ridiculous, this preoccupation with a mountain man she barely knew, but she could not seem to help it. The weather began to change as October settled in. The days remained warm and clear, but the nights grew cold, and the highest mountain peaks turned white with fresh snow. The leaves on the few deciduous trees around town turned gold and red, and the air took on a crisp quality that made Victoria think of autumn back east, though the landscape here was so different from Pennsylvania's rolling green hills. On a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the Stagecoach attack, Victoria was dismissing her students for the weekend when young Tommy Farley, the storekeeper's son, lingered behind. He was a bright boy of 11 with a mop of red hair and more freckles than seemed possible for one face. "Miss Lawson," he said hesitantly, "my pa asked me to tell you that Mr. Vance is in town in case you needed to know." Victoria's heart gave an undignified leap, but she kept her voice calm. "Thank you, Tommy. That is very thoughtful of your father." Tommy grinned like he knew exactly what that information meant, then dashed out the door before Victoria could scold him for his impudence. She looked around the schoolroom, suddenly seeing the chalk dust on her dress, the loose strand of hair that had escaped her pins, the general dishevelment that came from a long day of teaching active children. She should go back to the boarding house, change into something presentable, fix her hair. But what if Logan left town before she saw him? What if he stayed only long enough to buy supplies and then disappeared back into his mountains for another 3 weeks? Victoria made a decision. She grabbed her shawl, locked the schoolhouse door, and walked down the main street toward the general store with her heart pounding and her palms damp. She told herself she was just being friendly, thanking a man who had saved her life. There was nothing improper or forward about it, nothing at all. Logan's gray stallion stood hitched outside the general store, along with a pack mule loaded with bundles of furs. Victoria paused just outside the door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Then she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The general store was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. Tom Farley stood behind the counter, and two other customers browsed the shelves, and there, examining a display of steel traps, stood Logan Vance. He looked up when the bell above the door chimed, and his pale blue eyes met hers across the crowded space. "Miss Lawson," he said, straightening up. He seemed even larger inside the store, his head nearly brushing the hanging lanterns. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you." Victoria moved closer, hyper-aware of Tom Farley watching them with undisguised interest. "I wanted to thank you again for your help. I'm not sure I ever expressed my gratitude properly." "You thanked me plenty," Logan said. His eyes moved over her face, and Victoria wondered what he saw there. A dusty schoolteacher? A foolish Eastern woman out of her depth? Or something else? "How is the teaching going?" "It is wonderful," Victoria said, and meant it. "The children are bright and eager, for the most part. Of course, some of them would rather be outside than sitting at a desk, but that is the nature of children everywhere." A hint of a smile touched Logan's mouth. "I was one of those children, drove my teacher half mad with my fidgeting." "You went to school?" Victoria asked, then immediately felt embarrassed at the surprise in her voice. "I'm sorry. I did not mean to imply anything." "No offense taken. I did go to school, back in Virginia, before the war. My family had a farm in the Shenandoah Valley. Not large, but respectable enough." His expression grew distant. "That was a long time ago." "The war changed a lot of things for a lot of people," Victoria said softly. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know everything about him, but sensed that this was not the time or place. Tom Farley was practically leaning over the counter to hear better. "Will you be in town long?" "Just tonight. I need to pick up supplies and get back before the weather turns. There's snow coming." He hesitated, then said, "I'm staying at the hotel. They serve a decent meal in the dining room. If you would like to join me for supper, I would be glad of the company." Victoria's heart soared. "I would like that very much." 6 o'clock? 6 o'clock, Victoria agreed. She wanted to say more, but the store had gone suddenly quiet, and she could feel multiple pairs of eyes watching them, small towns and their gossip. She nodded politely, gave Tom Farley a look that dared him to comment, and walked out of the store with her head high and her cheeks burning. She spent the next 2 hours in a flurry of preparation that would have made her Philadelphia mother proud. She bathed, washed, and dried her hair, and dressed in her best gown, a deep blue silk that she had brought with her, thinking it would be suitable for church or special occasions. Mrs. Chen helped her with the tiny buttons down the back and arranged her hair in an elegant upswept style with a few curls left loose to frame her face. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Chen said, stepping back to admire her work. "That mountain man will not know what hit him." "It is just supper," Victoria protested weakly, "between two people who have shared a harrowing experience. Nothing more." Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look. "Of course it is, dear, and the sun is just a small candle in the sky." Victoria arrived at the hotel dining room precisely at 6 o'clock, her hands clutching her reticule and her stomach full of butterflies. The dining room was simple but clean, with half a dozen tables covered in white cloths and oil lamps casting warm pools of light. Logan stood when she entered, and Victoria's breath caught in her throat. He had transformed. He had bathed and shaved, and his dark hair hung loose and damp around his shoulders. He wore a white shirt that stretched across his massive shoulders and dark trousers instead of his usual buckskins. He looked uncomfortable in the civilized clothing, but he also looked devastatingly handsome in a rough, untamed way that made Victoria's knees weak. "Miss Lawson," he said, pulling out a chair for her. His manners were slightly rusty but genuine, and Victoria appreciated the effort. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," Victoria said, sitting down and trying to control her racing heart. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Vance." That hint of a smile touched his mouth again. "I figured I should try not to offend the civilized folk too much." A young woman brought them menus and water, and Logan ordered steak while Victoria chose chicken with vegetables. For the first few minutes, they made polite small talk about the weather and the town and Victoria's students. But gradually, as the meal progressed and the dining room remained quiet around them, the conversation deepened. Victoria told him about Philadelphia, about her family's expectations and her own need for independence. She told him about the moment she had seen the advertisement for a teacher in Arizona Territory and had known, with absolute certainty, that this was what she needed to do. She talked about her love of books and learning, her hope to make a real difference in her students' lives. Logan listened with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. He asked questions, thoughtful ones that showed he was genuinely interested in her answers. And slowly, haltingly, he began to share pieces of his own story. He had been a soldier in the war between the states, fighting for the Confederate side because that was what Virginia boys did, even if his family had never owned slaves and his father had opposed secession. He had seen terrible things, done terrible things, lost friends and brothers in arms to bullets and bayonets and disease. When the war ended, he had returned to the Shenandoah Valley to find his family's farm burned, his parents dead from fever that had swept through the valley during the final months of the war, and everything he had known gone. I could not stay there," Logan said quietly, his food mostly untouched on his plate. "Too many ghosts, too many memories. So I drifted west, working odd jobs, not really caring where I ended up. I was in Colorado when I met an old mountain man named Josiah Cross. He taught me how to trap, how to read the mountains, how to survive in the high country. When he died a few years later, he left me his claim and his traps and his horse, the father of my gray stallion. I have been in these mountains ever since." "You have built a good life," Victoria said gently. "A life on your own terms, away from the past." "Maybe," Logan said. "Or maybe I'm just hiding. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference." His pale eyes met hers, and Victoria saw pain there, old and deep but healing. "Until 3 weeks ago, I thought I was content. I had my mountains, my traps, my solitude, everything I thought I needed. And then I saw you climb up to drive that stagecoach with bullets flying, and something shifted inside me. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since." Victoria's breath caught. "I have not been able to stop thinking about you either," she admitted. "I tell myself it is foolish. We barely know each other. But when you walked into the schoolhouse last week, my heart started racing like I had run a mile. And when you left, the room felt empty even though I was surrounded by children." Logan reached across the table and took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip gentle despite his obvious strength. "I am not a good prospect for a woman like you," he said. "I live in a one-room cabin 20 miles from civilization. I spend months at a time alone in the wilderness. I have no family, no real future beyond surviving each winter and selling enough furs to buy supplies for the next. You deserve better than a half-wild mountain man with nothing to offer." "Maybe I do not want better," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "Maybe I want exactly what you are offering, even if you do not realize you are offering it. I came west because I was tired of people telling me what I should want, who I should be. I came west to choose my own path, and if that path leads to a mountain man with pale blue eyes and a good heart, then maybe that is exactly what I am meant to choose." Logan stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw hope warring with doubt in his expression. "You do not know what you are saying. You have only been here 3 weeks. You have not experienced winter in the territory, the isolation, the hardship." "Then let me learn," Victoria said. "Let me get to know you properly. Come to town more often. Write to me if you can. Give this, whatever this is between us, a chance to grow, because I think it could be something real and true and lasting if we are brave enough to let it." Logan's thumb stroked across the back of her hand, the touch sending shivers up Victoria's arm. "I was not expecting you," he said softly. "I was not expecting to want anything beyond my simple life. But you walked into that stagecoach office in your proper Eastern dress with your intelligent eyes, and you fought like a wild cat when danger came, and now I cannot imagine going back to my cabin and not thinking about you every minute of every day." "Then do not go back," Victoria said impulsively. "Stay in Williams, find work here. We could see each other properly, court like normal people do." "I'm not made for town life," Logan said, but there was regret in his voice. I tried, after the war. I tried to fit into civilization again. But I felt like I was suffocating, trapped behind walls, surrounded by too many people and too much noise. The mountains are where I belong. Then I will come to the mountains, Victoria said. Not to live, not yet, but to visit, to see your world, to understand the life you have built. Logan looked shocked. That would not be proper. A single woman visiting a man's cabin without a chaperone, the town would talk. The town already talks, Victoria said with a laugh. Half of Williams probably thinks we are secretly engaged by now, just based on us having supper together. And I do not care what they think. I care about you, Logan Vance. I care about getting to know you, and if that means breaking a few rules of propriety, then so be it. For the first time since she had met him, Logan Vance smiled, really smiled, and the transformation was stunning. It lit up his whole face, made his pale eyes sparkle, and revealed a warmth that took Victoria's breath away. You are something else, Victoria Lawson, he said, something completely unexpected and absolutely wonderful. Is that a yes? Victoria asked, her own smile matching his. That is a yes, Logan said. But you have to promise me something. If you come to the mountains and you realize it is not what you want, if you realize I am not what you want, you tell me honestly. No pretending, no sacrificing your happiness out of some misplaced sense of obligation. Promise me. I promise, Victoria said, if you promise me the same. If you realize you prefer your solitude, that you do not want me disrupting your life, you tell me honestly too. Deal, Logan said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. This rough mountain man, treating her like she was precious, like she mattered. It was more than she had ever dreamed of finding in the Arizona wilderness. They finished their meal talking about logistics. Logan would stay in town one more day to show Victoria the route to his claim, make sure she could find it if she chose to visit. He would come to Williams every 2 weeks instead of every 3, weather permitting, so they could see each other regularly. Victoria would arrange with Mrs. Chen to have a few Saturdays free, days when she could make the journey to Logan's cabin and back, though the widow would undoubtedly insist on accompanying her as chaperone for the first few visits at least. When they finally left the dining room, the hour was late and the streets of Williams were quiet and dark. Logan walked Victoria back to the boarding house, his presence large and solid beside her. At the door, he paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart flutter wildly. "May I kiss you?" he asked quietly. "Just once to seal our agreement." "Yes," Victoria breathed. "Please, yes." Logan cupped her face in his big hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and bent down to press his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet and brief, nothing improper or scandalous, but it sent warmth flooding through Victoria's entire body. When he pulled back, she swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her arm. "Good night, Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night, Logan," she whispered. She watched him walk away into the darkness, then floated into the boarding house in a daze. Mrs. Chen took one look at her face and smiled, but said nothing, just handed her a lit candle and shooed her upstairs to bed. Victoria lay awake for a long time that night, her fingers touching her lips where Logan had kissed her, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She had come west seeking adventure and purpose and independence. She had found all of that in her teaching position, but she had also found something she had not known she was looking for. She had found love, wild and unexpected, and absolutely perfect. The next morning, Logan arrived at the boarding house early with his horse and a gentle mare borrowed from the livery stable. He had brought a proper side saddle, though Victoria surprised him by saying she could ride astride if he had men's trousers that might fit her. He looked scandalized and amused in equal measure, but produced a pair from his saddlebags that she could belt tight enough to stay up. Mrs. Chen was less amused, but she helped Victoria change and provided a long coat to preserve some modicum of decency. "You are going to give the church ladies apoplexy," the widow said, but she was smiling. "Go on, enjoy your ride. Be back by dark or I will send Tom Farley and half the town out looking for you." Logan led Victoria north out of Williams, up into the foothills where the pinyon and juniper gradually gave way to taller ponderosa pines. The morning air was crisp and cold, their breath misting in front of them, but the sun climbed higher and warmed the day to something pleasant. Logan pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, a creek that ran year-round, teaching her the route so she could find her way if she came alone. "Though I would prefer you not travel alone," he said seriously. "The Turner gang is still out there somewhere, and there are other dangers, mountain lions, bears, rough terrain. Wait until I come to town and I will escort you up and back." Victoria wanted to argue, to insist on her independence, but the memory of bullets tearing through the stagecoach was still fresh enough to make her cautious. "I will be careful," she promised. They rode for nearly 3 hours, climbing higher into the mountains where the air grew thinner and the pines grew thicker. Finally, Logan led her through a narrow defile between 2 rock walls and out into a small hidden valley. A creek ran through the center of it, lined with aspens that had turned brilliant gold with the season. And on a slight rise overlooking the water stood a cabin, small but well built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. "Home," Logan said simply. Victoria looked around in wonder. The valley was beautiful, protected on all sides by rocky ridges, with the creek providing water and the forest providing firewood and game. It was isolated and wild, but it had a peace to it that she could feel settling into her bones. This was Logan's sanctuary, the place where he had healed from the wounds of war and loss. "It is beautiful," she said honestly. "I can see why you love it here." Logan dismounted and helped her down, his hands spanning her waist easily. He showed her the cabin's interior, which was surprisingly neat and organized. One large room served as living space, with a stone fireplace, a table and chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves holding supplies and equipment. Furs hung from the rafters, curing in the cool air. A bearskin covered the floor near the fireplace. Everything was simple and functional, but it was clearly a home, not just a shelter. "I built it myself," Logan said, a note of pride in his voice. "Took me most of a winter, but it is solid. Kept me warm through some brutal storms." They spent the afternoon together, Logan showing Victoria his trap lines and teaching her about the animals he hunted. She met his gray stallion properly, a magnificent animal named Storm who nuzzled her hand looking for treats. Logan made them lunch over the fire, venison stew that was surprisingly good, and they ate sitting on the porch watching the aspens shimmer in the breeze. Victoria asked him about his daily life, and Logan told her about the rhythm of the seasons, the hard work of setting and checking traps, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the long, quiet evenings by the fire with nothing but his thoughts for company. He talked about the wildlife he had observed, the changing weather patterns, the rare visits from other mountain men or trappers passing through. "It sounds lonely," Victoria said gently. "It was," Logan admitted, "but I thought I preferred it that way. I thought being alone was safer than risking caring about someone and losing them again." He looked at her, his pale eyes intense. "You changed that. You made me realize I do not want to be alone anymore. I want to share this with someone. I want to share it with you." Victoria reached over and took his hand. "I want that too. But I cannot give up my teaching, not yet. Those children depend on me, and I made a commitment to the town. So we will have to find a way to balance both worlds, yours and mine, until we figure out what our future looks like together." "I can live with that," Logan said, "as long as I know you are truly choosing this, choosing me, not just being swept up in some romantic notion of mountain life." "I am choosing you," Victoria said firmly. "The mountain life is just a bonus." Logan laughed, the sound rich and warm, and pulled her into his arms. Victoria went willingly, resting her head against his massive chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the valley. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Logan reluctantly stood, pulling Victoria up with him. "We need to start back. I promised Mrs. Chen I would have you home by dark, and I keep my promises." The ride back to Williams passed too quickly, both of them quiet but comfortable in the silence. When they reached the edge of town, Logan helped Victoria dismount in a shadowed spot where they would not immediately be observed. 2 weeks, he said, holding her hands in his. "I will be back in 2 weeks, and we will do this again if you want to." "I want to," Victoria said. "I want to see you as often as possible, Logan. 2 weeks feels like forever." For me too, he said. He kissed her again, longer this time, and Victoria felt herself melting into him. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I should let you go before I do something improper. I would not mind, Victoria said boldly, then blushed at her own words. I just meant that I trust you. I know what you meant, Logan said gently, and I feel the same way. But you deserve to be courted properly, even if we are doing it in our own unconventional way. I want to do this right, Victoria. She kissed him once more, quickly, then stepped back before she lost her nerve entirely. 2 weeks, then. Do not make me wait any longer than that. I would not dream of it, Logan said. He watched her walk away toward the boarding house, then swung back up on Storm and rode out of town into the gathering darkness. Victoria made it to her room before the tears came, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming happiness and the sheer intensity of her emotions. She had never felt like this before, never experienced this combination of desire and affection and absolute certainty that she had found something rare and precious. Mrs. Chen knocked gently on her door and came in without waiting for an answer, taking one look at Victoria's tear-streaked face and pulling her into a motherly hug. He is a good man, the widow said softly. Rough around the edges maybe, but good where it counts. You have chosen well, honey. I have not even known him a month, Victoria said, her voice muffled against Mrs. Chen's shoulder. How can I feel this strongly after such a short time? The heart knows what it knows, Mrs. Chen said simply. My husband and I knew each other 3 days before he proposed, and we had 30 good years together before he passed. Sometimes it just happens fast, like lightning. Nothing wrong with that, as long as you are both sure. I am sure, Victoria said. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. The next 2 weeks crawled by at an agonizing pace. Victoria threw herself into her teaching, preparing her students for the upcoming holiday season and organizing a small pageant for the families. She attended her regular activities in town, deflecting curious questions about Logan Vance with polite smiles and non-answers. At night, she lay in her narrow bed and thought about him, about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, about the feeling of being held in his strong arms, about the kiss they had shared. She also wrote letters home to Philadelphia, carefully edited versions of her new life that mentioned the teaching and the town, but left out the Rustler attack and made no mention whatsoever of Logan. Her parents would have collective heart failure if they knew she was courting a mountain man. Time enough to tell them when things were more settled between them. Logan arrived in Williams exactly 2 weeks later, riding in on a cold November morning with frost still clinging to the rocks. Victoria saw him from the schoolhouse window and had to forcibly stop herself from running outside to greet him. She had a classroom full of students to teach, propriety to maintain. But at lunch break, she practically flew out the door to the general store, where she knew he would be conducting his business. He was there, talking to Tom Farley about supplies, and his face lit up when he saw her. They had a few precious minutes of conversation, carefully watched by half the town, before Victoria had to return to her students. But Logan came to the boarding house that evening for supper, which Mrs. Chen had generously offered to provide in her private dining room, serving as chaperone while giving them enough privacy to actually talk. They established a pattern over the following weeks. Logan came to town every 2 weeks like clockwork, and Victoria visited his cabin twice more before the winter snows set in, always with Mrs. Chen accompanying her, though the widow was tactful enough to give them space once they reached the valley. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories and histories and dreams. They went on long walks together when Logan was in town, earning knowing looks from the citizens of Williams, but no real censure since they were clearly courting seriously. And they fell deeper in love with each passing day. By the time Christmas approached, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with Logan Vance. She knew his moods, his habits, his preferences. She knew how he took his coffee, how he liked his steak cooked, how he would sit and carve small figures from wood when his hands needed something to do. She knew about the nightmares he sometimes had from the war, and she knew how to soothe him when they came. She knew his strength and his gentleness and his unwavering honor. And she knew, without a doubt, that he loved her just as deeply. She could see it in the way he looked at her, hear it in his voice when he spoke her name, feel it in every gentle touch and careful kiss. He had not said the words yet, perhaps waiting to be sure, perhaps simply not used to speaking his feelings aloud. But Victoria knew, and that was enough. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was harsh in the Arizona mountains. Heavy snows fell in December and January, isolating Logan in his valley for weeks at a time. He made it to Williams for Christmas, bringing Victoria a beautiful fur muff he had made himself, and she gave him a wool scarf she had knitted in the evenings, her fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar work, but her heart in every stitch. They attended the Christmas service together at the small church, and afterwards shared hot cider and cookies at a community gathering where they were treated as an established couple. In late January, during a brief thaw, Logan came to town looking serious and determined. He found Victoria at the schoolhouse after classes had ended for the day, and she knew immediately that something important was happening. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her, then crossed the room in 3 long strides and took both her hands in his. "I know I do not have much to offer," he said without preamble. "I'm still just a mountain man with a small cabin and a string of trap lines, but I have some savings put by, and I can build onto the cabin, make it bigger and more comfortable. And I love you, Victoria. I have loved you since the day you climbed up on that stagecoach and drove it to safety with more courage than most men I have known. I want you to be my wife, if you will have me. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like, wherever it takes us." Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, Logan. I have loved you for months, and I want nothing more than to be your wife." Logan lifted her off her feet and spun her around, and Victoria laughed through her tears. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, deeply, in a way that left no doubt about his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "I should ask you properly," Logan said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a ring, simple but beautiful, made of twisted gold and silver wire with a small turquoise stone set in the center. "It is not fancy, but I made it myself from metal I traded for. The stone is from these mountains. It is not much, but it is honest and true, like what I feel for you." "It is perfect," Victoria said as he slipped it onto her finger. "Everything about you is perfect, Logan Vance." They were married in early March, as soon as the worst of the winter storms had passed. It was a simple ceremony in the Williams Church, attended by most of the town and officiated by the circuit preacher who had ridden in especially for the occasion. Victoria wore a dress of ivory silk that had been her grandmother's, altered to fit her and freshened with new lace. Logan wore a suit borrowed from the mayor since he owned none of his own, and though he looked uncomfortable in the civilized clothing, he also looked heartbreakingly handsome. Mrs. Chen cried through the whole ceremony. Tom Farley served as Logan's best man, and the mayor's wife stood up as Victoria's matron of honor since she had no family present. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Logan kissed Victoria with such tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. The town threw them a celebration at the hotel, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. Victoria danced with Logan, teaching him the steps while he apologized for treading on her feet, and they were both laughing so hard they could barely manage the movements. It was perfect and joyful, and everything Victoria had ever dreamed a wedding should be. As the sun set, they rode out of Williams together toward Logan's Valley, toward their home. Victoria had resigned her teaching position, though she had agreed to continue tutoring students who could make the journey to the valley once the weather improved. She had everything she owned packed onto a mule, including her precious books and the quilts the church ladies had made as wedding gifts. Mrs. Chen had supplied them with enough provisions to last until spring, and the whole town had turned out to wave goodbye and wish them well. The valley looked magical in the late winter evening, the snow still deep but the ice on the creek beginning to break up with the warming temperatures. Logan carried Victoria over the threshold of the cabin, and she laughed at the absurdly romantic gesture from her normally practical husband. He had spent the last month adding a room to the cabin, giving them a separate bedroom and more space to live. He had also built new furniture, including a larger bed and a rocking chair that he said would be perfect for when they had children someday. That first night as husband and wife, they made love by firelight, with the wind howling outside and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a cocoon. Logan was gentle and patient, mindful that this was Victoria's first time, and she felt cherished and safe in his powerful arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together under layers of furs and blankets, talking softly about their dreams for the future. "Dozo, are you sure about this?" Logan asked, stroking her hair. "About leaving town, living up here in the wilderness? It is not too late to change your mind. We could find a place in Williams, and I could try to make a go of town life." "I am exactly where I want to be," Victoria said firmly. "With you, in this beautiful valley, building our life together. I love teaching, but I love you more. And I can still teach in my own way, tutoring children who come up here, maybe even starting a small school in the valley someday if other families settle nearby. But this is home now, Logan. You are home." Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley into something out of a fairy tale. The aspens leafed out in brilliant green, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and baby animals appeared everywhere. Logan taught Victoria how to fish in the creek, how to identify edible plants, how to track game and read the signs of the forest. She proved to be an apt student, though she drew the line at learning to set traps herself, preferring to help with the less bloody aspects of mountain life. They settled into a comfortable routine. Logan tended his trap lines and hunted for meat while Victoria managed the cabin, tended a small garden she had started, and tutored the handful of students whose parents brought them up to the valley once a month. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the peaks or curl up by the fire while Victoria read aloud from her books and Logan worked on his carving. In May, Victoria realized she was pregnant. She told Logan on a warm evening when the valley was full of birdsong and the scent of pine. He was so overcome with joy that he could not speak for a full minute, just held her tight and buried his face in her hair. They spent the rest of that night making plans, talking about names and wondering whether they would have a son or daughter, imagining their future as parents. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Logan was endlessly careful with Victoria, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, though she laughed at his overprotectiveness and insisted she was perfectly capable of her normal activities. Mrs. Chen rode up to visit several times, bringing baby clothes she had sewn and advice on childbirth. The doctor from Williams also made the journey twice to check on Victoria and assure Logan that everything was proceeding normally. In late October, as the aspens turned gold again and the first hints of winter appeared on the highest peaks, Victoria went into labor. Logan had arranged for Mrs. Chen and the doctor to come stay at the cabin for the expected time, and both were present when their son came into the world after 10 hours of hard labor. He was healthy and strong, with a shock of dark hair and his father's pale blue eyes, and when Logan held him for the first time, tears streamed unashamedly down the mountain man's weathered face. They named him James William Vance, after Logan's father and the town where their story had begun. Little James thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and curious as the months passed. Logan proved to be a devoted father, and Victoria would often find him sitting in the rocking chair he had made, cradling their son and singing old lullabies in his deep voice. The cabin rang with baby laughter and the sounds of family life, and Victoria had never been happier. The years that followed were full and rich. They added 2 more children to their family, a daughter named Elizabeth in 1881 and another son named Thomas in 1883. Logan expanded the cabin twice more to accommodate their growing family, and Victoria turned out to be a natural mother, patient and loving and endlessly creative in keeping 3 active children entertained and educated. The valley became known in the surrounding area as a place of welcome and safety. Other families began to settle in the region, drawn by the beauty and the reports of good hunting and trapping. Logan helped newcomers establish their own claims and taught them mountain skills, becoming a kind of unofficial leader of the small community that developed. Victoria finally got her wish and established a small school in the valley, teaching not just her own children, but those of several other families who had settled nearby. Williams remained an important part of their lives. They traveled to town several times a year for supplies and to maintain their friendships there. Mrs. Chen became the children's honorary grandmother, spoiling them shamelessly whenever they visited. The town watched the Vance family grow with affection and a certain amount of pride, claiming partial credit for the successful match between the Eastern schoolteacher and the wild mountain man. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Logan surprised Victoria by taking her back to the spot where they had first met, the place on the canyon road where the Rustler attack had happened. They rode there on a beautiful September day, leaving the children with Mrs. Chen for the weekend, and stood looking at the rocks and curves that Victoria remembered so vividly from that terrifying afternoon. "I never thought I would be grateful to a gang of rustlers," Logan said, his arm around Victoria's waist as they watched the sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. "But if they had not attacked that stagecoach, I might never have met you. I would still be alone in my valley, thinking I was content, not knowing what I was missing." "We were meant to find each other," Victoria said, leaning into his solid warmth. "Maybe not in the way it happened, but somehow, somewhere, our paths would have crossed. I truly believe that." "I love you," Logan said, turning her to face him. "More now than the day we married, if that is even possible. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A family, a purpose beyond just surviving, a reason to look forward to every new day." "I love you too," Victoria said, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek. "You taught me what it means to be truly brave, truly free, truly alive. You gave me adventure and passion and a love story better than any novel I ever read." They kissed as the sun sank below the peaks, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. Later, they would ride back to Williams and collect their children, then return to their valley and their cabin and their life. But for this moment, they simply stood together on the canyon road where their story had begun, grateful for rustlers and courage, and a mountain man who had taken her hand that day and disappeared into the fog of their uncertain future, only to emerge together into something clear and bright and lasting. 15 years after their marriage, the valley was home to nearly 20 families, and Victoria's school had grown to include more than 30 students. Logan had become a respected figure in the region, called upon to mediate disputes and offer advice on mountain living. Their children were growing into strong, capable young people. James, now 16, was already as tall as his father and showed every sign of matching Logan's impressive build. Elizabeth, at 14, had inherited her mother's love of learning and her father's practical skills, equally comfortable with a book or a fishing rod. Thomas, at 12, was the adventurous one, always exploring and getting into minor scrapes that gave his parents gray hairs. Victoria looked around the expanded cabin one evening in 1894, watching Logan teach Thomas how to properly sharpen a knife while Elizabeth helped with dinner and James read aloud from the newspaper that had arrived from Williams that afternoon. The fire crackled in the hearth, the smell of venison stew filled the air, and outside the windows, snow was beginning to fall in soft white curtains. This was her life, so different from anything she had imagined as a girl in Philadelphia, so much better than any plan she had made for herself. She caught Logan's eye across the room and he smiled at her, that same smile that had stolen her heart all those years ago. The mountain man and the schoolteacher, united by danger and choice, and a love that had only deepened with time. They had built something real and lasting, a family and a home and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Victoria smiled back at her husband, her heart full to bursting with gratitude and joy. She had come west seeking independence and purpose, and she had found those things in her teaching. But she had also found something infinitely more precious. She had found her home, her heart, her future, in the arms of a man who had once been a stranger, but was now as essential to her as breathing. The snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the valley in white silence, and the Vance family gathered around the table for dinner. Logan said grace, his deep voice thanking God for blessings received and asking protection for the year ahead. Then they ate together, talking and laughing, planning for tomorrow and remembering yesterday, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges came, they would face them together. In the mountains of Arizona Territory, in a hidden valley where aspens turned gold each fall and the creek ran clear year-round, a love story that had begun with bullets and fear had transformed into something beautiful and enduring. And when Victoria Vance finally drifted off to sleep that night, held safe in her husband's arms with their children sleeping peacefully in nearby rooms, She knew with absolute certainty that every choice she had made, every risk she had taken, had been worth it for this. For love, for family, for the wild and wonderful life they had built together in the shadow of the mountains they both called home.